What's going on, guys? I wanted to do a different type of video today. I haven't really done a video like this on the channel yet. I'm basically just going to be looking at the playoff picture and different ways teams can get in. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to be giving my predictions for who will be in the playoffs. And then I'll give my predictions for who will ultimately win the national championship game. But let's start off with looking at each team's path to the playoffs. For the number one team in the country, Georgia, it's pretty simple. You have to win out. Even with the loss, you might even be able to get in, as long as it's a closer game against Alabama. I personally think Georgia is the best team in the country, and they have an easier path to making the playoffs. And even with the loss to a one-loss Alabama team, I could see the Pac-12 winner getting left out because Georgia is back-to-back national champions. And their only loss would be a close one to Alabama, and then Alabama would have the best win up to that point. I don't know what the chances are of this happening, but it would be heartbreaking to the Pac-12, but you gotta do what's right. For the number two team in the country, Ohio State, you have to win out and you're in. I would be a little scared to be an Ohio State fan because with the loss to Michigan, you guys will probably get left out unless you guys do get some help. You would need Florida State to lose, or you would need to hope that the Pac-12 crumbles these next couple weeks, which is possible because Oregon State does play Washington and Oregon. You would also need to keep an eye on Texas and hope they take a loss. There's a chance we could see Ohio State in the playoffs with the loss to Michigan. They would just need a little bit of help. But according to the college football playoff predictor, an 11-1 Ohio State team with one loss to Michigan has a 45% chance to make the playoffs. And for the number three team in the country, Michigan, similar to Ohio State, you just need to win out. But if Michigan loses to Ohio State and doesn't make the conference championship game, it would be a little bit harder for Michigan to get into the playoffs, as they would only have a 23% chance to make the playoffs. Ohio State has played a tough non-conference. Michigan has played nobody outside of Penn State. And they do have an upcoming game against Ohio State. That's going to be their only other tough game. And for the number four team in the country, Florida State, win in and you're in. Just like the three teams above them, it's pretty simple. Most likely, unless something crazy happens. And they don't really have a tough road there. They had that game against Florida in the Swamp, and then they have a game against Louisville. Now, if Florida State takes a loss, it will be a little harder for them to get in. With that loss in the ACC championship, they would go to an 8% chance of making the playoffs. With the win, they would be at a 99% chance. So it's really do or die in the ACC championship game for Florida State, but the game against Florida in the Swamp could also ruin their dreams too. And for the number five team in the country, you have to win out, and you have a 98% chance to make it. But I would still be a little bit worried, honestly, because of how bad they are in analytics. What if they do go 13-0, but Alabama and Georgia are both 12-1, and Michigan and Florida State are 13-0? I wouldn't be surprised if Washington got left out. Or would they leave Florida State out in that situation? I don't know. Maybe they would actually take Georgia out with the one loss and losing the SEC championship. I just don't see it. But what if Washington goes 12-1 with one loss to Oregon in the Pac-12 championship rematch game? In that scenario, they would have a 4% chance to make it. Washington would need a lot of help if they take a loss to Oregon. So just like Florida State, it's do or die. Even if you only have one loss, winning your conference is what matters the most. And for the number six team in the country, Oregon, you need to win out and you're most likely in, as you would have a 91% chance to make it if you win out. With the loss, there's almost no way you make it unless some sort of miracle happens. Oregon would get in over a one-loss Florida State and over a one-loss Big Ten team. But just like Washington, would they get in over a one-loss Georgia or a one-loss Alabama? If Alabama somehow beats Georgia in the SEC championship game, the college football world is going to be flipped upside down. So everybody besides Alabama fans needs to be rooting for Georgia to win that game against Alabama. There's definitely a path for Oregon though, so we'll see what they can do. And for the number seven team in the country, which is Texas, you have to win out. And it feels 50-50 for Texas right now for making the playoffs if they win out. According to the playoff predictor, they do have a 64% chance to make it if they do win out. And they would need a little bit more help than Oregon does. But same with all the other one-loss teams, you lose and you're completely done for the season. And for the number 8 team of the country, Alabama. For Alabama, I assume they win out and they're most likely going to be in, being they did avenge their one loss in week 2, and they would beat the number 1 team of the country, Georgia. But according to the playoff predictor, they would only have a 66% chance to make it if they win out. With the loss, Alabama would not make it unless they get a lot of help. And I mean a lot of help, because there's a lot of good teams this year. And it's going to be really, really hard to make it as a 2-loss team. And it's going to be a little bit hard to even make it as a 1-loss team, depending on how good your resume is. But for these last two teams, I'm just covering for the sake of it, and I don't see them making it. But there's a very, 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 very slight chance that they make the playoffs. That was a little bit too many varies, but that's how low the chances are. But for number 9, Louisville, if Louisville somehow wins out and beats Florida State, they would have a 25% chance to make the playoffs. They would need the Pac-12 to crumble, and they would need Texas to take a loss. And even a 2-loss Alabama could possibly get in over them. But you would want Georgia to beat Alabama. But then that leaves Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State, and Louisville. But like I said, a 2-loss Alabama could still possibly get in over Louisville. And then another team that would have a shot making it over them in a scenario where they beat both Oregon and Washington is Oregon State. The number 10 team in the country, Oregon State, is a long shot. But what if they do somehow knock Washington and Oregon out of the playoffs and beat both of them? And then they win the Pac-12 championship game. The Pac-12 is getting more recognition this year, and they might have a higher chance to make it than Louisville if they win out because of the resume they've had. But it would be harder to make it because who actually believes they will beat Washington and Oregon back-to-back weeks and then go on and win the Pac-12 championship game? What an underdog story that would be. But absolutely nobody believes they're going to do that. But there is a road there. But they do need Louisville to beat Florida State. And there would be a debate on if a 2-loss Oregon State team makes it over a 1-loss ACC team because of the resume. But then Oregon State could possibly make it over a 2-loss non-conference champion, Alabama. According to the playoff predictor, if Oregon State wins out, they would have a 14% chance to make the playoffs. And their last 2 wins would be against top 10 teams. And then the conference championship game would probably be a win against a top 15 opponent. That would be a huge resume builder for them, as they do already have a top 25 win against Utah this year, and they win against a decent UCLA team, but that win isn't as good anymore, as they have fell out of the top 25 and came down to earth a little bit, and they do have 4 losses. The last 2 teams are very unlikely, but the first 8 teams I listed are all with high chances of making the college football playoffs as long as they do win out. It's going to be a tough weekend for all the committee members on making their choices on who makes the playoffs. There's going to be a lot of chaos going into the college football playoffs. Conference championship week might have 3 top 10 matchups with Louisville against Florida State, Oregon against Washington, and then Alabama and Georgia. And also possibly top 15 matchups with the winner of Ohio State and Michigan against an Iowa team who is 16th right now. And if Iowa finishes 10-2, they will be a top 15 team. And then Texas and Oklahoma will likely be a top 15 matchup too. It's going to be a crazy conference championship week, and it'll be interesting to see how the committee picks the teams. But without further ado, let's get my picks for the 4 teams who I think will ultimately make the playoffs. And I'm going to do this quick so I can get this video finished. At my number 1 spot, I do have Georgia at number 1, and I do have them winning out and beating Alabama. At number 2, I have Michigan. Similar to Georgia, they have looked really good this year, and I do have them winning out and beating Ohio State. Now for these last 2 spots, it's between the winner of Oregon and Washington and either Texas, Florida State, and Ohio State at the other spot. I do think there's a chance Florida State will lose a game, and then that would leave a debate between Texas and Ohio State, depending on if Texas wins out. But for now, I have to go with the safe choice on Florida State and finishing the season at 13-0, and they only have 2 decent matchups left to make it, as they do play at FCS North Alabama this week, and they won't lose that game. And for my last playoff spot, I do have Oregon. At first, I wasn't sure who I would pick between Oregon and Washington, or if even any of them would actually make it. But the last couple weeks, I've leaned towards Oregon winning the neutral site matchup because they have looked like a very legit team, and I do think they will win the rematch. Now on to my national championship prediction. Before I get to that, let's predict the 2 semifinal games, starting off with number 4 Oregon and number 1 Georgia. I do think this will be a closer game than last time. And maybe if Oregon had a different opponent, they would win. But I do think Georgia wins, maybe by a touchdown, and Georgia moves on to the national title. On to another semifinals game, I have Michigan beating Florida State by around 10 points. I do believe that if Florida State plays their best game, they can definitely compete with Michigan. Florida State has struggled with injuries this year, and I do think they haven't reached their ceiling of how good they can play, maybe outside that LSU game. But Michigan has looked like a very complete team this year. Now on to the national championship game. Let's get straight to the point. I think Georgia three-peats. I got Georgia by a touchdown in this game. I think Georgia is the best team in college football. And there's a bit of a gap, but it's very hard to three-peat, so it's going to be interesting to see what they can do. But that's going to do it for the video. If you guys want to see more of these types of videos weekly, let me know down in the comments below. And also don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. And also consider joining my Discord in the description below. And peace out, guys.